After my son kicked me out of the house, I secretly blocked all access to my accounts. Every single one of them. Every property. Every penny. He didn't know it, but I controlled absolutely everything from the shadows. And then came that night. The night Ethan and Olivia decided to throw a $50,000 housewarming party to celebrate their home. My home. The estate I built with my own hands alongside my late husband. They had invited 200 people from high society, a live orchestra, imported champagne, high-end catering, flowers flown in from across the country. My daughter-in-law wore a champagne-colored dress that cost more than many families earn in a year. Ethan wore a custom-made Italian tuxedo. Both of them strolled among the guests as if they were the kings of the world, as if they had built that empire with their own sweat. The music resonated through the great hall. Laughter, glasses clinking, camera flashes capturing every moment of their triumph. And then, at the peak of the celebration, when my son raised his glass to give a toast, the music suddenly stopped. The lights flickered. A sepulchral silence fell over the hall like a concrete slab, and a mysterious man appeared at the entrance. Tall, dark gray suit, black leather briefcase under his arm, 2 security guards behind him, not the guards Ethan had hired, others, bigger, more serious. The man walked directly toward my son with measured, lethal steps. He opened the briefcase, he extracted documents, and he said something that made all the guests go hysterical. But before I tell you exactly what he said, you need to understand how a mother who gave everything ended up being betrayed by her own blood. My name is Eleanor. I am 65 years old, and for 40 years, I built an empire alongside my husband. We weren't magazine cover billionaires, but we had something better than that. We had stability. 3 apartment buildings in the best parts of the city. A 2-story estate with gardens that looked like they were taken from a European postcard. 2 commercial spaces rented to thriving businesses. Everything paid off. Everything generating income, month after month. Everything. Running like a Swiss watch. My husband passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. Silent and brutal. He left me alone, but he left me with the finances in order. Or at least, that's what I thought. After the funeral, my attorney, Robert, called me to his office. He was a trusted man, someone who had worked with us for decades. He explained calmly that I should consider putting the main properties in my son Ethan's name, to avoid estate taxes, he told me. To simplify things when I was gone. To protect the family assets. Ethan was my only son. I had raised him with solid principles. I had given him an education at the best schools. I had prepared him to inherit what we built. I trusted him with that blind faith that only a mother can have. So I signed the papers. The estate was put in Ethan's name. 2 of the buildings as well. The commercial spaces. In the documents, I still appeared as the administrator, with certain legal powers, but the property title now bore his name. Robert assured me it was the right thing to do, that I would maintain operational control, that nothing would really change. And for a while, nothing changed. Ethan lived with me at the estate. He had his own wing of the house. He worked part-time, managing one of the properties. Although, I'll be honest, he wasn't exactly dedicated, but he was my son. I forgave his lack of ambition because I thought he would eventually mature, that he would find his path. Then he met Olivia. She appeared in our lives 2 years ago like a gust of expensive perfume and calculated smiles. She worked in public relations for a company I had never heard of. She always wore designer clothes. She always had perfect hair. She always knew exactly what to say to make Ethan feel important. At first, I tried to be kind. I tried to welcome her into the family. But there was something in her eyes, something cold, something that reminded me of the sharks I had seen once in an aquarium. Always moving, always calculating, always hungry. They got married 6 months after meeting. An ostentatious wedding that cost over $30,000. I paid half because Ethan asked me with those puppy dog eyes I had known since he was little. Olivia chose everything. The venue, the ivory flowers that covered every table, the 7-course menu, the orchestra, the photographer who had worked with celebrities. I barely had a voice in the decisions. When I tried to suggest something, Olivia would smile with that sharp smile and say she already had everything under control, that I shouldn't worry, that it was her and Ethan's day. I should have seen it then. The signs were all there, glowing like neon lights in the dark. But a mother's love is blind, dangerously blind. After the wedding, they officially moved into the estate. It's not that Ethan didn't live there before, but now Olivia was there too, and with her came a change in the atmosphere of my home. It started subtly, little comments. She would tell me my decorating style was outdated, that the drapes in the main hall needed to be replaced, that the furniture my husband and I had chosen with such care was depressing. One day, I came home, and she had hired a decorator without consulting me. They changed the living room furniture. They put up modern paintings that looked like meaningless paint splotches. They replaced the cream-colored drapes with metallic gray fabric that made everything look cold. When I protested, Ethan put a hand on my shoulder and told me not to worry, that the house needed a renovation, that Olivia had good taste, that I should relax and enjoy it. Relax. As if I could relax while watching the memories of 40 years of marriage disappear under layers of gray paint and minimalist furniture. But that was just the beginning. Olivia started making comments about my age, never direct, always wrapped in fake concern that made me feel guilty for getting annoyed. She would ask if I didn't feel tired, if it wouldn't be better for me to rest more, if I hadn't thought about moving to a smaller place, more manageable for a woman of my age. A condo, perhaps. Something without stairs, without gardens to tend. She spoke to me as if I were a decrepit old woman who couldn't fend for herself. I was 65, not 90. I walked 3 miles every morning. I managed 3 buildings without help. I handled the finances of the entire family estate. But to Olivia, I was a burden, an old piece of furniture that didn't fit her new decor. And slowly, month after month, she began to work on Ethan. I would hear them talking at night. Their voices filtered through the walls of my room. Olivia would tell him it was time for him to take control of his life, that he should stop depending on his mother for everything, that the estate was in his name, and he had the right to make decisions, that I treated him like a child, that he was never going to be a real man if he kept living in my shadow. Ethan defended her weakly at first. He said I was his mother, that I had given him everything, that he couldn't just kick me out. But Olivia was persistent, patient, poisonous, like a snake injecting its toxin drop by drop until the prey can no longer move. Ethan's comments toward me began to change. He started questioning me when I made decisions about the properties. He asked why I had authorized certain repairs without consulting him, why I had chosen a specific contractor, why I spent money on maintenance when he considered it unnecessary. I reminded him that I had managed these properties for decades, that I knew what I was doing, that preventative maintenance was essential to maintain the value of the real estate. But he wasn't listening anymore. Olivia had planted the seed of doubt, and that seed was growing like poisonous weeds. Bills started arriving in Ethan's name that I hadn't authorized, extravagant purchases, a new sports car for him, designer clothes for Olivia, trips to luxury resorts, dinners at restaurants where a bottle of wine cost more than $1,000. When I asked him where he was getting the money, he looked at me with irritation. He told me it was the rental income from the properties, his money, from his properties, as if I hadn't dedicated 40 years of my life to earning every penny of that wealth. One day, I found Olivia in my office. She was sitting at my desk, reviewing the ledgers. I asked her what she was doing there. She looked up with that cold smile and told me she just wanted to understand the family finances better. That as Ethan's wife, she had a right to know. I told her those documents were private, that I handled the finances and would continue to do so. Her smile became sharper. She told me maybe it was time for things to change, that Ethan was the legal owner of everything, that I was just the manager, and that managers could be replaced. That night I spoke to Ethan. I told him Olivia was overstepping, that she was trying to take control of things that didn't concern her. He got furious. He accused me of being controlling, of not being able to let go of power, of not trusting him. He shouted that she was his wife and had the right to be involved in family decisions, that I had to accept that things had changed, that he wasn't a child anymore. I tried to stay calm. I reminded him of everything we had built together, his father and I. I told him all of this was for him, for his future, but that he needed to be responsible, that he couldn't spend without control, that Olivia was manipulating him. The moment I mentioned her name, Ethan exploded. He told me I was jealous, that I couldn't stand seeing him happy, that Olivia was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that I just wanted to ruin his marriage. He stormed out, slamming the door, and I stood there, in the middle of the living room I had decorated with my husband, feeling my world beginning to crack. The following weeks were a silent nightmare. Ethan barely spoke to me. When we crossed paths in the house, he averted his gaze. Olivia, on the other hand, became bolder. She started giving orders to the cleaning staff, as if she were the owner. She changed the gardener's schedule without consulting me. She fired the cook who had worked with us for 15 years, because, according to her, his food was too traditional and boring. When I tried to intervene, she ignored me completely. And Ethan backed her up. He told me Olivia was right to modernize things, that I clung too much to the past, that I needed to learn to let go. Let go. That phrase became his favorite. Let go of control. Let go of the past. Let go of my place in the house I had built myself. One morning I went down to breakfast and found Olivia sitting at the head of the dining table. My spot. The spot where I had sat for 30 years. Where my husband sat before he passed. She was drinking coffee from my favorite mug, the porcelain one with gold details my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. She looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes as she took a slow, deliberate sip. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The message was clear. This was no longer my home. I poured coffee into another cup and sat at one end of the table. The silence was thick, uncomfortable. Olivia took out her phone and started texting, ignoring me completely. As if I were invisible, as if I no longer existed. I finished my coffee quickly and left the house. I needed air. I needed to think. I drove to the office of Robert, my attorney. He had been a close friend of my husband and me for decades. If anyone could help me understand my legal situation, it was him. When I walked into his office, Robert looked up from his documents and smiled warmly, but his smile faded when he saw my expression. I told him everything, every detail, every humiliation, every poisonous comment from Olivia. Every moment Ethan had chosen his wife over his own mother. Robert listened in silence, hands clasped on his desk. When I finished, he sighed deeply. He asked me if I remembered exactly what I had signed when we put the properties in Ethan's name. I told him it had been a title transfer, that I was still the administrator, but he was the legal owner. Robert nodded slowly. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick folder. I recognized it. It was the folder with all the transfer documents. He began to flip through the papers carefully, pausing on certain pages, reading with attention. After several minutes that felt like hours, he looked up, and then he smiled. It wasn't a smile of pity or concern. It was a smile I knew well, the smile of a lawyer who has just found exactly what he was looking for. He told me to remember that when we signed those documents, he had insisted on including certain protective clauses I had completely forgotten about in the last 3 years. He explained that yes, the properties were in Ethan's name, but I maintained an irrevocable power of attorney over all of them. Irrevocable, that word rang in my mind like a bell. I asked him what exactly that meant. Robert leaned back in his chair and began to explain with that patience that characterized him. The irrevocable power of attorney meant that although Ethan was the owner on paper, I had absolute legal power to make any decision regarding those properties. I could sell them, rent them, mortgage them, transfer them, and Ethan could do absolutely nothing without my signature. Nothing. Furthermore, all rental income went directly to an account that only I controlled. Ethan had access to a secondary account where I transferred a fixed amount monthly for his expenses. But the bulk of the money, the real income, was under my total control. Robert looked at me intently and asked if Ethan knew this. If I had ever explained to him in detail how the legal arrangement really worked. I thought for a moment. The truth was, no. When we signed the papers, Ethan barely paid attention. He signed where Robert indicated, smiled, hugged me, and thanked me for trusting him. But he never read the full documents. He never asked about the technical details. And I, assuming he understood, never stopped to explain every clause. Robert closed the folder and slid it toward me across the desk. He told me I had options, many options. I could revoke Ethan's access to the secondary account. I could block any attempt by him to use the properties as collateral for loans. I could, if I wanted, initiate a legal process to reclaim the property titles based on misuse of family assets. And most importantly, he told me something that made my heart beat faster. He reminded me that the estate, although in Ethan's name, remained legally my primary residence, and that according to the clauses we had included, I could not be evicted from it without my consent. If Ethan tried to kick me out, he would be violating the agreement, and that would give me legal grounds to reverse all transfers immediately. I asked him if he was sure, if I really had as much power as he said. Robert smiled again and nodded. He told me he would never allow a woman who had worked her whole life to be left vulnerable, that the clauses we had included were his gift of protection to me, his way of ensuring that even if things went wrong, I would be safe. I left his office feeling different, stronger, more secure, but I also decided something important. I wasn't going to use that information yet. I was going to wait. I was going to observe. I was going to let Ethan and Olivia show their true nature, because I had the feeling they weren't finished yet, and I wanted to see how far they were capable of going. I didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks later, I arrived home after supervising some repairs at one of the buildings and found suitcases in the main foyer. My suitcases. I recognized every one of them. The brown leather one I had bought for my honeymoon, the navy blue one I used for short trips, the smaller wine-colored one my husband had given me. They were all there, lined up by the front door like soldiers waiting for orders. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I entered my room and found Olivia supervising 2 maids who were packing my clothes, my dresses, my shoes, my books. Everything that was mine was being shoved into boxes without any care. I asked her what on earth she was doing. She turned to me with that expression of fake concern she had perfected. She told me they had made a family decision, that it was time for me to have my own space, that they had found a charming apartment near downtown, small, manageable, perfect for a woman of my age, that they were doing me a favor. I felt the blood boiling in my veins. I told her this was my house, that I wasn't going anywhere, that she had no right to touch my things. Olivia sighed as if she were dealing with a tantrum-throwing child. She told me the house was in Ethan's name, that he had made the decision, and that I should accept reality and behave with dignity. I went down the stairs like a hurricane. I found Ethan in his office, the one that had previously been his father's study. He was sitting behind the solid oak desk, reviewing papers with an expression of feigned concentration. He knew I was coming. He had probably been waiting for this moment. I slammed the door behind me so hard the diplomas on the wall shook. I asked him if it was true, if he had really decided to kick me out of my own house. Ethan didn't even look up. He kept looking at the papers as if they were the most interesting thing in the world. Finally, after a silence that seemed eternal, he spoke. His voice was cold, distant, as if he were speaking to a stranger and not the woman who had brought him into the world. He told me it wasn't my house, that it was his house, that the property title had his name, not mine. That he had been very generous letting me live there for 3 years after the transfer, but now he and Olivia needed their space, their privacy, their life without interference. I reminded him that I had built this house, that every brick had been paid for with the sweat of my brow and his father's, that everything he had was thanks to my work. Ethan finally looked up, and what I saw in his eyes broke my heart. There was no love there. There was no gratitude. There was only resentment. Resentment accumulated over who knows how many months of Olivia's poisonous whispers. He told me he was tired of living in my shadow, that his whole life he had been Eleanor's son, that I had never let him be his own person, that I controlled everything, the money, the properties, the decisions, that he was just a puppet signing where I told him that Olivia had opened his eyes, that she had shown him he deserved respect, that he deserved to be the real owner of his life, and for that, I had to go. I tried to stay calm. I explained that I wasn't controlling him, that I simply managed what we had built because I had experience, because I knew how things worked, that he could learn, that we could work together, but Ethan shook his head. He told me he didn't want to learn from me anymore, that he wanted to do things his way, with Olivia by his side, and that my presence was an obstacle, a constant reminder that he hadn't built anything by himself. I asked him if he realized what he was doing, if he understood that he was destroying our relationship for a woman he had barely known for 2 years. Ethan stood up abruptly. His chair rolled back and hit the wall. He pointed his finger at me as if I were an insubordinate employee. He shouted that Olivia was his wife, his family, and that I had to respect that. That if I couldn't accept his marriage, then I had no place in his life. I told him this wasn't about accepting his marriage, that this was about Olivia manipulating him to take over everything that didn't belong to her, that she didn't love him, that she loved the money, the status, the estate. Ethan laughed. It was a bitter laugh, full of contempt. He told me I was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand seeing him happy, that I was inventing absurd theories because I couldn't let go of control, that Olivia truly loved him, and that he loved her more than he had loved anyone in his life, including me. Those last words fell on me like stones. I felt something inside my chest break, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead. I took a deep breath and asked him how much time I had to leave. Ethan seemed surprised by my calm, probably expected screaming, tears, drama. But I had learned long ago that silent dignity was a woman's most powerful weapon. He told me he had reserved the apartment for me, that I could move that weekend, that he would pay the first month's rent as a gesture of goodwill, that after that, I would have to manage with my pension. I asked him what pension. He frowned, confused. I explained that I didn't have a pension, that all my money came from the rental income of the properties that were now in his name. Ethan shrugged. He told me I should have saved better, that I couldn't expect to live off his income forever, that it was time for me to learn to be independent. His income. As if he had worked a single day to generate that income. As if he had negotiated lease contracts. As if he had handled difficult tenants at 3 a.m, as if he had sacrificed anything other than his inflated pride. I nodded slowly. I told him I understood perfectly, that I would leave that weekend as he requested, that I wouldn't cause any more trouble, that he and Olivia could have the house to themselves. Ethan seemed to relax. He even smiled a little. He told me he knew I would understand, that deep down I wanted the best for him, that this was best for everyone, that we could maintain a cordial relationship, visit each other from time to time. I left his office without saying anything else. I went up to my room where Olivia was still supervising the packing. She looked at me with a barely contained smile of victory. I told the maids they could leave, that I would finish packing my things. Olivia seemed disappointed that there wasn't a dramatic scene. She wanted to see me beg, see me crumble, but I didn't give her that pleasure. When they left, I sat on the edge of my bed, the bed where I had slept for 30 years, where my husband had held me on difficult nights, where I had mourned his death. I looked around the room, the paintings on the walls, the photographs on the dresser, a whole life contained in that space. And then I took out my phone and called Robert. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had just happened, the apartment, the eviction, Ethan's words. Robert listened in silence. When I finished, he asked me what I wanted to do. If I wanted to stop this now, if I wanted to use the legal clauses to prevent Ethan from kicking me out of the house. I thought for a moment. The answer came clear and cold. I told him no, that I would let them do exactly what they wanted, that I would move to the apartment without resistance, that I would act like the defeated mother they expected to see. Robert remained silent for a moment. Then he asked me if I was sure, if I understood what that meant. I told him I understood perfectly, and then I gave him very specific instructions. I wanted him to discreetly block my access to all the main accounts. Not close them, just block them in such a way that Ethan couldn't use them without my explicit authorization. I wanted him to prepare documents to revoke any power Ethan might think he had over the properties. I wanted him to investigate exactly how much he had spent in the last 6 months. Every purchase, every extravagance, every penny. And most importantly, I asked him to keep all of this in absolute secrecy, not to tell anyone, not even his secretary, that this information was only known to him and me. Robert asked me why. Why let them kick me out if I could stop it? I explained my reasoning. If I resisted now, Ethan and Olivia would be more careful. They would look for legal ways to strip me of real power. They would hire lawyers. They would become cautious. But if I left without a fight, if I acted defeated and submissive, they would feel invincible. They would become careless, arrogant. And in that arrogance, they would make mistakes. Mistakes I could use against them when the right time came. Robert stayed quiet for several seconds. Then I heard something that sounded dangerously like a laugh. He told me he understood perfectly, that he would prepare everything as I asked, that Ethan and Olivia would have no idea what was coming for them until it was too late. I hung up the phone and looked out the window toward the gardens I had tended for decades. The roses I had planted with my own hands, the fountain my husband had installed as an anniversary gift. Everything I was about to leave behind, but not forever, only temporarily. Because Ethan and Olivia were about to learn a very valuable lesson, that underestimating a woman who had built an empire was the biggest mistake they could make in their lives. The weekend arrived faster than I expected. I packed my belongings with care, every object wrapped in paper, every memory stored in boxes labeled with my own handwriting. Ethan hired a moving company. Not even he came to help. He sent strangers to dismantle my life while he and Olivia went out for breakfast somewhere expensive. The movers were kind. One of them, an older gentleman with gray at his temples, looked at me with pity when he was carrying a particularly heavy box of books. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this, if there wasn't someone who could help me. I smiled and told him I was perfectly fine, that sometimes in life you have to take steps backward to then take leaps forward. He didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. The apartment Ethan had chosen for me was in an old building downtown. It wasn't horrible. It had 2 bedrooms, a functional kitchen, and a small living room with a window overlooking a noisy street. But compared to the estate, with its high ceilings and extensive gardens, it was like going from a palace to a cell. The walls were a depressing beige color. The floors creaked. You could hear every noise from the neighbors, every argument, every television, every baby crying in the middle of the night. I unpacked my things slowly. I placed my photographs on a small table. I arranged my books on a shelf that wobbled a bit. I hung my clothes in a closet that smelled of dampness. And when I finished, I sat on the sofa I had brought from my old room and looked around my new reality. I could have gotten depressed. I could have cried. I could have called Ethan begging for forgiveness for crimes I never committed. But instead, I took out my phone and called Robert. I asked him if he had done what I asked. He confirmed that he had. All main accounts were blocked. Ethan only had access to the secondary account I had been using to give him his monthly allowance. At that moment, that account had approximately $8,000. Robert had calculated that Ethan and Olivia were spending around $15,000 a month on their lifestyle. It had taken them barely 2 weeks after the wedding to start living beyond their real means. The sports car Ethan had bought. The loan came from a corporate card linked to the properties, card that was now canceled. The trips to luxury resorts, paid with the same card. The new furniture for the estate. The remodeling of the master bath. Everything charged to credit that assumed rental income would keep flowing without interruption. But that income was no longer flowing to Ethan. It flowed to accounts that only I controlled. Robert explained that he had redirected all automatic deposits. The tenants continued paying their rent on time, but that money, approximately $45,000 a month, combined from all properties, now went directly to accounts Ethan didn't even know existed. I asked him how long he thought it would take them to notice. Robert reflected for a moment. He told me it depended on how carefully they reviewed their finances. If they were smart, they would realize in 2 weeks. If they were careless, maybe a month. Knowing Olivia, I bet on the first option. I wasn't wrong. 10 days after my move, Ethan called me. His voice sounded tense, controlled. He asked if we could meet for coffee, that he needed to speak with me about some administrative matters regarding the properties. I accepted calmly. I suggested a coffee shop near my apartment. A modest place with formica tables and watery coffee, very different from the places Olivia and he used to frequent. Ethan arrived 15 minutes late. He was wearing a caramel-colored sweater and designer jeans. His hair was perfectly styled, but there was something in his expression, a small wrinkle of worry between his eyebrows. He sat across from me and ordered an espresso. We exchanged pleasantries for a moment. How was my apartment? How was he? How was Olivia? All very civilized, very polite. Then he went straight to the point. He told me he had noticed some irregularities in the accounts, that the rental income hadn't arrived this month, that the accounts which normally showed automatic deposits were empty, that he had tried to use the corporate card and it had been declined. He asked me if I knew anything about it. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm and bitter. I asked him why he was consulting me. I reminded him that he was the owner of the properties, that I was just the former manager, that I no longer lived in the house, that I no longer had access to the documents. Ethan clenched his jaw. He told me not to play with him, that he knew I had handled the finances for years, that I must know where the money was. I explained in a soft voice that when I moved, I assumed he would take full control of the administration, that I thought that was what he wanted, independence, to be his own man, to make his own decisions. Ethan slammed his palm on the table. People at nearby tables turned to look. He lowered his voice and told me he needed the access codes to the main accounts, that he had bills to pay, that he had financial commitments. I asked him what kind of commitments. His face turned slightly red. He told me that was none of my business, that he simply needed access to his money. To his money. Those words again. I nodded slowly. I told him I understood his frustration, that I would speak to Robert to see what could be done, that it was probably just a technical glitch, a delayed transfer, something that could be easily resolved. Ethan relaxed a little. He thanked me. He told me he knew he could count on me, that despite everything, I was still his mother. He paid for his coffee and left in a hurry. He probably had another important meeting, or another extravagant purchase to make. I watched him leave through the coffee shop window. He got into his silver sports car, the one that had cost $90,000. The one on which he still owed $60,000 because he had made a minimal down payment, expecting to pay the rest with property income. Income he would no longer receive. I smiled to myself. The trap was closing, and he didn't even realize it. The following week, Ethan called me 3 times, each call more desperate than the last. He asked if I had spoken to Robert, if I had solved the problem. When the money would arrive, I told him Robert was investigating, that these things took time, that banks were slow, to have patience, but Ethan didn't have patience. He had bills, the car payment, the credit card with which Olivia had bought a complete wardrobe, the loan he had taken out to remodel the estate's kitchen with imported appliances. Everything was coming due, and he had no way to pay. He tried to use the properties as collateral for a quick loan. It was rejected. The bank explained that although his name was on the title, there were legal restrictions preventing any transaction without additional authorization. Ethan didn't understand. He had been told he was the owner. Robert had been very clear in explaining that everything was in his name. But what Robert hadn't explained in detail were all the protective clauses, all the restrictions, all the legal locks I had insisted on including. Ethan tried to contact the tenants of the buildings directly. He wanted them to pay him directly. But the leases clearly specified that all payments must be made to a specific account. The account I controlled. The tenants, confused by the request, called me to confirm. I told them to ignore any instructions from Ethan, to continue paying as they always had, that everything was under control. Then the calls from Olivia started. Her voice was different from Ethan's, sharper, more threatening. She told me she knew what I was doing, that I was sabotaging Ethan because I was resentful, that this was financial abuse, that they could sue me. I asked her in an innocent voice what she was talking about. I reminded her that Ethan was the owner of everything, that I had no power, that I was just an old woman living in a modest apartment with her non-existent pension. Olivia screamed for me to stop playing games, that she knew I controlled the money, that Ethan had been a fool to trust me. I told her that if she had proof of any irregularity, to present it to the corresponding authorities, that I had nothing to hide. She hung up furious, and I sat in my small apartment with a cup of tea in my hands, feeling a calm I hadn't experienced in months. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Susan, my lifelong friend. She had heard rumors. Ethan and Olivia were organizing a party, a huge party, A housewarming celebration. Their house, the estate that was now officially theirs after kicking out his nuisance of an old mother. Susan asked me if it was true, if they were really going to do something so shameless. I confirmed that yes, that I had seen the invitation circulating on social media. 200 guests, live orchestra, high-end catering, imported champagne. A party costing $50,000. Susan asked me how they planned to pay for it. I smiled even though she couldn't see me. I told her probably with credit cards, with loans, with the blind confidence that money would keep flowing as always. That Olivia had convinced Ethan this party was an investment, a way to establish themselves in high society, to demonstrate their success, their power. Susan paused. Then she asked me what I was going to do about it. I told Susan I wasn't going to do anything, that I was simply going to let the party happen. She stayed silent for a moment, processing my words. Then she asked if I was sure of what I was doing, if it wouldn't be better to stop this before it got out of control. I explained that it was already too late to stop, that Ethan and Olivia had crossed a point of no return, that this party would be their moment of glory, and it would also be their downfall. Susan sighed deeply and told me she trusted me, that if I needed anything, just to call her. We hung up, and I continued with my quiet routine in the apartment. Meanwhile, according to my sources, Olivia was in full production mode. She had hired the best event planner in the city, flowers imported from Ecuador, a chef who had worked in Michelin-starred restaurants, a lighting company that would transform the estate gardens into a spectacle worthy of a royal wedding. Ethan, for his part, had ordered a new tuxedo, Italian, custom-made, $4,000. Olivia had bought 3 different dresses before deciding on a champagne-colored one with embedded crystals that cost $7,500. Everything charged to credit cards, assuming income would arrive eventually. Robert called me a week before the party. He informed me that Ethan had tried to access a line of credit using the properties as collateral. Again, it was rejected. He had also tried to sell one of the commercial spaces. The potential buyer had done their due diligence and discovered the legal restrictions. The sale was canceled immediately. Ethan was desperate. I know because he finally came to visit me at the apartment. He appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced. When I opened the door, I was surprised by his appearance. He had deep circles under his eyes. His hair wasn't perfectly styled as always. There was a stain on his shirt. I invited him in. He sat on my old sofa and looked around the apartment with an expression I couldn't decipher. Pity, maybe, or guilt, but not enough to change anything. I sat across from him and waited. Ethan began to speak without looking me in the eye. He told me things were complicated, that he had had some problems with the accounts, that the banks were being difficult, that he needed my help to resolve some technical matters. I asked him what kind of matters. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He explained that he needed me to sign some documents, authorizations to access certain accounts, permissions to use the properties as collateral. Simple administrative things that had been complicated by absurd legal technicalities. I asked him why he needed the money so urgently. Ethan finally looked at me. There was something in his eyes, not exactly regret, but discomfort, yes. He told me about the party, that he had already paid deposits, that the vendors were waiting for full payment, that if he canceled now, he would lose all the money already invested. And besides, all his friends, his business contacts, the important people in the city, everyone was invited. Canceling would be humiliating. I asked him how much he had spent so far. Ethan hesitated. Then he admitted that between deposits, the tuxedo, Olivia's dress, and other related expenses, he had invested about $20,000. Money that had come from credit cards with sky-high interest rates. I asked him how he planned to pay the rest, the other $30,000 that were missing. Ethan looked at me with that expression he had used all his life when he wanted something, that pleading boy look that had always melted my heart. He told me that's why he was there, that he needed me to release the funds from the rents, just this month, just to cover the party. Afterward, a way would be found to stabilize everything. I leaned back in my chair and watched him in silence. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I could stop all this with a simple signature. I could save my son from the humiliation that was looming. I could rescue him, as I had rescued him so many times in his life. But then I remembered. I remembered how he had kicked me out of my own house. I remembered Olivia's words calling me a burden. I remembered Ethan shouting at me that everything was in his name, that I was nobody, that I should accept my place. And I made a decision. I told him I couldn't help him. Ethan blinked, confused. He asked me why not. I explained in a soft voice that when I moved here, he had been very clear. I no longer had any role in the properties. I no longer managed anything. Everything was his responsibility, and that accessing the accounts required authorizations that I honestly didn't know if I still had. That I would have to consult with Robert, but Robert was traveling and wouldn't return until after the date of the party. Ethan went pale. He told me this was an emergency, that he couldn't wait. I suggested that maybe he should postpone the party, or scale it down, do something more modest and manageable. Ethan shook his head violently. He told me it was impossible, that invitations were already sent, that people had already RSVP'd, that Olivia would die if they had to cancel. I asked him if he had spoken to Olivia about the financial problems. His silence gave me the answer. He hadn't. He had been hiding the truth from her, probably ashamed to admit he didn't have the control he had proclaimed to have. I suggested he be honest with her, that he explain the situation, that together they find a solution. Ethan stood up abruptly. He looked at me with a mixture of frustration and something that looked like betrayal. He told me he had come looking for help from his mother, that he thought I, despite everything, would still be his mother, that he couldn't believe I refused to help him in such a critical moment. I reminded him calmly that he had been very clear about the boundaries of our relationship, that I lived here, in this modest apartment, because he had decided I no longer had a place in his life, that he couldn't expect me to solve his problems when he had cut all ties binding us except the biological one. Ethan walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned and said something I will never forget. He told me he would find a way to make that party happen, that he didn't need me, that he had never really needed me, that Olivia was right about me, that I was a manipulator who used money to control people, and that he was better off without me. He slammed the door, and I remained sitting in my small living room, with the echo of his words floating in the air. Part of me, a very small part, felt pain. But the greater part of me felt something different. It felt confirmation that what I was doing was right, because Ethan needed to learn this lesson. He needed to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people like trash and expect them to rescue you when things get tough. The following days were a whirlwind of activity that I observed from a distance. Ethan had secured more credit. He had mortgaged his car. He had sold some jewelry I had given Olivia in better times. He had borrowed from friends with promises to pay them back after the party. Somehow, he had gathered enough money to complete the payments. The party was still on. Robert called me 2 days before the event. He asked if I was ready, if I was sure I wanted to go through with the plan. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my life. He confirmed that everything was prepared, that he would be there at the exact moment, that the documents were ready, that the security guards he had hired were briefed, that the eviction order was signed and ready to be executed. Only my signal was missing. I asked him if there was any way this could go wrong. Robert laughed softly. He told me he had been a lawyer for 40 years, that he had handled cases much more complicated than this, that everything was covered from every possible legal angle, that Ethan and Olivia had no way out. I hung up the phone and walked to the window of my apartment. Outside, the city continued with its normal rhythm, people coming and going, living their lives, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. I thought of my husband, of what he would say if he could see this. He would probably tell me I was too severe, that Ethan was young and stupid, that he deserved another chance. But my husband had always been softer than me, more lenient. I was the one who made the difficult decisions, the one who set boundaries, the one who ensured lessons were learned, and this was a lesson Ethan needed to learn. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep, not from nervousness, but from anticipation. I got up early and made myself a coffee. I sat on my small balcony and watched the sunrise. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. A new day, the day everything would change. I received a text message from Susan. She asked if I was okay, if I needed company. I replied that I was perfectly fine, that everything was going exactly as I had planned. She sent me a thumbs-up emoji and a heart. I spent the day doing mundane things. I cleaned the apartment. I read a book. I prepared a simple meal. I acted as if it were a completely normal day. But inside me, there was a clock counting down. Every hour that passed brought me closer to the moment. To the moment Ethan and Olivia would discover the truth. To the moment their castle of lies would crumble, and I would be there, not physically, but in spirit, watching justice finally being served cold. The night of the party arrived with a clear sky and a bright moon. From my apartment, miles away, I could perfectly imagine what was happening at the estate. The gardens illuminated with string lights, the tables decorated with linen tablecloths and elaborate centerpieces, the orchestra tuning their instruments, the catering preparing trays of canapes, and Olivia, moving everywhere in her champagne dress, ensuring every detail was perfect. Robert had sent me a message confirming he was in position, that the guards were ready, that everything would happen exactly at 9 in the evening, when the party was at its peak, when all the guests were present, when Ethan and Olivia were in the center of the hall, enjoying their moment of glory. I dressed with care. I wasn't going to be inside the party, but I was going to be close. I wanted to see the final result with my own eyes. I chose a simple, dark gray dress. I put up my hair, I put on the pearl earrings my husband had given me, and I left my apartment with the calm of someone going to an appointment scheduled long ago. Susan picked me up in her car. She had insisted on accompanying me. She told me she couldn't let me do this alone, that after 40 years of friendship, she had the right to be there. We drove in silence toward the neighborhood where the estate was. We parked half a block away, in a spot where we could see the entrance, but not be easily seen. From there, we watched the arrival of the guests. Luxury cars, women in designer dresses, men in tuxedos, all entering with smiles and glasses of champagne already in their hands. The music started playing around 8. We could hear it from where we were, soft at first, then louder as the night progressed. Susan asked me if I was sure, if I really wanted to do this. I told her there was no turning back, that Ethan had made his decisions, that Olivia had shown her true nature, and that now it was time for them to face the consequences. At 8:45, I saw Robert's car park in front of the estate. It was a discreet black sedan, nothing flashy. Behind him arrived an unmarked white van. 2 private security guards got out, large, serious men in dark suits and earpieces. Robert got out of his car with his black leather briefcase under his arm. He headed toward the entrance of the estate with firm, measured steps. Susan squeezed my hand. I took a deep breath, and we waited. From where we were, we couldn't see exactly what was happening inside. But we could imagine. Robert entering the crowded hall, the music stopping abruptly, the silence falling like a heavy curtain, the gazes of 200 people turning toward him, and Ethan and Olivia, in the center of it all, with their smiles freezing on their faces. 5 minutes passed that felt like hours. Then we heard screams, raised voices, the unmistakable sound of chaos. Susan and I looked at each other. It had begun. Guests started coming out of the estate, first in small groups, murmuring amongst themselves with confused expressions. Then en masse, like a stampede of frightened cattle. Some took out their phones, recording. Others simply rushed to their cars, wanting to get away from whatever was happening inside. A woman in an emerald dress ran past our car. She was telling her companion that this was embarrassing, that she had never seen anything like it, that, how was it possible someone organized a $50,000 party in a house that wasn't even theirs? An older man with a gray mustache commented loudly that he had suspected it from the beginning. That Ethan never seemed like the type of person who could build that kind of wealth. That clearly he had been living off his mother's money, the comments continued. Each one crueler than the last. Each one destroying the reputation Ethan and Olivia had tried to build with such desperation. Then I saw Olivia run out of the estate. Her $7,500 dress was wrinkled, her makeup ruined by tears of fury. She was screaming toward the inside, at someone we couldn't see, saying this was impossible, that there was a mistake, that they had to stop this. Behind her came Ethan. My son. He looked destroyed. His imperfect tuxedo no longer looked so perfect. His hair was messy. He walked as if in a trance, unable to process what was happening. Robert came out after, accompanied by the security guards. In his hands, he carried documents that shone under the entrance lights. He showed them to Ethan, pointing to specific lines. Ethan shook his head again and again, as if denying it could change the reality of what was written on those papers. Robert spoke in a loud, clear voice. Although we couldn't hear the exact words from where we were, the tone was unmistakable. It was the tone of someone executing a legal order. Cold, professional, irrevocable. Olivia tried to snatch the documents from Robert. One of the guards intervened, blocking her gently but firmly. She screamed something about lawyers, about suing, about injustice. Robert simply pointed toward the street. He was ordering them to leave, to abandon the property immediately. Ethan fell to his knees. Literally, he knelt on the driveway of the estate, in front of all the guests who were still leaving, in front of people with their phones recording every second of his humiliation. He was pleading, begging Robert for some way to resolve this, to give him time, to talk to me, to fix things. Robert shook his head. He took more documents out of the briefcase. He showed them to Ethan. From where I was, I could see they were bank statements, numbers in red, debts, maxed-out credit cards, unpaid loans. Robert was showing Ethan, in front of everyone, the true magnitude of his financial disaster. The guards began to bring out Ethan and Olivia's belongings from the estate. Suitcases, boxes, the same suitcases they had used to move my things months ago. The irony was not lost on me. Olivia tried to go back into the house. The guards stopped her. She screamed that they had jewelry inside, personal objects, things they needed. Robert informed her that everything would remain in legal custody until the financial situation was resolved. That given everything had been bought with credit they couldn't pay. Technically, none of it really belonged to them. Susan whispered beside me that this was brutal. I nodded. It was, but it was necessary. It was the only way Ethan would understand. The only way he would learn that people are not disposable, that you cannot build your happiness on the ruins of the one who gave you life. The last guests finally left. The estate remained silent, with all its lights still on, but empty. Ethan and Olivia were standing by their silver sports car, the car they still owed money on. They spoke in low voices, gesturing. Olivia pointed toward the estate, then toward Robert, clearly blaming everyone but herself. Ethan simply looked at the ground, defeated. Robert walked toward them one last time. He handed them an envelope, probably the formal eviction notice and details of their financial obligations. Then he turned around and walked to his car. When he passed near where we were parked, he saw us. He nodded briefly, a silent confirmation that everything had gone according to plan. Ethan and Olivia finally got into their car. The engine started, and they left, driving away from the estate, from the ruined party, from the 50,000 wasted dollars, from the public humiliation they had just suffered. Susan asked me if I wanted to go into the estate, see the mess they had left, the remains of the party that never ended. I told her not yet, that first I wanted to see something else. I asked her to drive me around the city, to follow Ethan's car from a safe distance. She looked at me with surprise but didn't question my request. She started the car, and we began to follow them discreetly. Ethan drove aimlessly for almost half an hour. He passed through streets he knew well, the park where I took him to play when he was a child, the school where he had studied, places full of memories of a life that no longer existed. Finally, he stopped in front of a hotel. Not a luxury one. It was a middle-class hotel, one of those that rent rooms by the night at reasonable prices. We watched as Ethan and Olivia got out of the car with their few suitcases, how they entered the lobby with slumped shoulders, how they paid for the room, probably with one of the last credit cards that still worked. Susan turned off the engine, and we stayed watching the hotel entrance. She asked me how long I thought it would take Ethan to contact me. I told her maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe never. That depended on how deep his pride was and how great his desperation was. She sighed and told me I had been stronger than she could have been. That seeing your own son fall like that must be heartbreaking, I answered honestly. I told her yes, it hurt. That part of me wanted to run into that hotel, knock on his room door, and tell him everything would be okay. That mom would fix everything as she always had. But that was exactly the reason we were in this situation, because I had always fixed everything. I had never let Ethan face the real consequences of his actions, and now, at almost 40 years old, the time had come for him to grow up. The following days were strangely quiet. I returned to my routine in the apartment. Robert updated me regularly on Ethan's movements. He had tried to get more loans, all rejected. He had tried to sell the sports car, but he owed more than it was worth. He had tried to contact the friends who had lent him money for the party, but none answered his calls. Olivia, according to my sources, had abandoned him. She had moved in with a friend, taking what little of value they had left. She had filed for divorce papers a week after the disastrous party. She wasted no time jumping off the sinking ship. Ethan remained alone in that hotel. Robert showed me photographs he had obtained legally as part of the documentation process. Ethan had lost weight. His clothes were no longer designer, but what he could buy at discount stores. His hair grew without the regular maintenance it used to have. He looked like what he really was, a man who had been living a lie and who now faced the raw and naked truth. I received a call from him 3 weeks after the party. His voice sounded different, broken, without the arrogance that had characterized every conversation of the last few months. He asked if we could see each other, not at a coffee shop, at my apartment. He needed to talk to me in private. I accepted. I gave him the address even though he already knew it. I told him I would be waiting for him the next afternoon. When he arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who knocked on my door wasn't the arrogant Ethan who had kicked me out of my house. He was a reduced, diminished, broken version of my son. He entered without a word. He sat on the same sofa where he had sat weeks ago when he had come to ask me for money for the party. But this time, there was no trace of the attitude he had brought then. I offered him coffee. He nodded without looking at me. I prepared 2 cups in silence. When I returned and handed it to him, he finally looked up. There were tears in his eyes. He told me he was sorry, that he had been an idiot, that he had let Olivia manipulate him, that he had betrayed everything I had taught him, that he had forgotten who had really built everything he enjoyed. I listened without interrupting. Ethan continued talking, words coming out of him like a river that had been dammed up too long. He told me how Olivia had left him, how his friends had disappeared when the money ran out, how he had tried to get a job, but his resume was embarrassing. He had never really worked. He had never built anything by himself. His whole life had been managing properties I had already established, and he hadn't even done that well. He told me he understood now that I hadn't been controlling him, that I had been trying to teach him, to prepare him, but that he had been too proud, too stupid to see the difference between guidance and control. I asked him what he wanted from me. Ethan lowered his gaze. He told me he didn't know if he had the right to ask for anything, that I probably hated him, that he wouldn't blame me if I never wanted to see him again. I told him in a soft voice that I didn't hate him, that it was impossible for a mother to hate her son, but that I also couldn't just forget what had happened, that I couldn't rescue him without there being consequences, without there being real changes. Ethan nodded. He asked me what he had to do, what I needed from him to even consider giving him another chance. I explained my conditions. First, he had to get a real job, not in the family properties, a job where he earned his own money, where he learned the value of hard work. Second, he had to attend therapy. He needed to understand how he had reached this point, how he had allowed someone like Olivia to manipulate him so easily. Third, he had to pay every penny of the debts he had accumulated. I wasn't going to do it for him. He had to assume responsibility for his financial mistakes. And fourth, more important than everything else, he had to show me with actions, not words, that he had really changed, that he had learned, that he would never treat people as disposable again. Ethan listened to every condition. When I finished, he asked me how much time he had. I told him all the time he needed, that I wasn't going anywhere, that the properties would still be there, but only when he complied with everything I had asked. Only then would we consider talking about his future in the family business. He stood up slowly. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Genuine gratitude, not the superficial gratitude of someone receiving a gift, but the deep gratitude of someone who has just received a second chance they don't deserve but will take with both hands. He hugged me. It was a clumsy, awkward hug, full of regret and shame, but it was also real. When he pulled away, he told me he wouldn't disappoint me, that he would do everything I had asked, that he would prove he could be the man I had tried to raise. I walked him to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. He asked me if I had ever realized what he planned to do, if I had known from the beginning that Olivia was manipulating him, if all this, the eviction, the blocked accounts, the ruined party, had been planned. I looked him straight in the eyes. I told him the truth. That yes, that from the moment he signed the documents without reading them, I had known that someday I might need to protect myself. That Robert and I had included all those clauses precisely for a scenario like this. That when he kicked me out of the house, I decided to let him keep digging his own grave until it was deep enough. Ethan processed this information slowly. Then, to my surprise, he smiled. It wasn't a bitter or resentful smile. It was a smile of understanding. He told me he now understood where his intelligence came from, that I had always been 10 steps ahead of everyone, and that he hoped someday to be half as astute as me. Ethan left, and I stood at the door of my apartment for a long while. I watched his figure walk down the hallway, how his shoulders were no longer as slumped as when he had arrived. There was something different in his walk. He still carried the weight of his mistakes, but now he also carried something else: purpose. I closed the door and returned to my living room. I sat on the sofa and looked out the window toward the city stretching before me. The lights began to turn on as dusk gave way to night. I thought about everything that had happened in the last few months: the betrayal, the eviction, the public humiliation. And now, this small step towards something that could resemble redemption. Susan called me that night. She asked how the meeting with Ethan had gone. I told her every detail. She listened in silence and, when I finished, told me something I didn't expect. She told me I was the strongest woman she knew, but also the wisest, that many mothers in my position would have reacted in 2 ways. Either they would have cut all contact permanently, letting the son sink completely, or they would have forgiven immediately without consequences, perpetuating the cycle of irresponsibility. But I had found a third path, the path of tough love, the path that hurts but truly transforms. I thanked her for her words. I told her I didn't know if I had done the right thing, that maybe I had been too cruel, that maybe I had taken things too far. Susan laughed softly. She reminded me of the party, the 50,000 wasted dollars, the humiliation Ethan and Olivia had tried to inflict on me by celebrating in my house as if I had never existed. She told me I hadn't been cruel, that I had simply allowed reality to be the teacher they needed. The following months were of gradual transformation. Ethan got a job at a property management company. It wasn't glamorous. He earned a fraction of what he used to spend monthly. He lived in an apartment even smaller than mine, shared with 2 roommates. He ate simple food. He wore practical clothes. He took public transportation. He lived as most people live. And he learned. He called me once a week, not to ask for money, not to complain, simply to tell me about his progress, about the lessons he was learning, about how every day he understood a little more the value of honest work. He started therapy as I had asked. His therapist, he told me, was helping him understand the patterns that had led him to be so easily manipulated, the need for external validation, the fear of not being enough, the tendency to look for easy solutions instead of building something real. Robert met with me regularly to update the status of the properties. The income continued to arrive consistently. The buildings were well maintained. The tenants were satisfied. Everything ran like clockwork, exactly as it had worked for decades. He asked me what I planned to do with the properties long term, if I would consider putting them back in Ethan's name eventually. I told him I would consider it, but only when Ethan proved he was ready, not with words, but with years of consistent actions. 6 months after the disastrous party, I decided it was time to return to the estate. Robert had kept everything in perfect condition. The cleaning staff went regularly, the gardens were tended, the bills paid. But no one had lived there since that night. When I walked through the front door, the memories hit me like a wave. Every corner held a story. The living room, where my husband and I had drunk coffee every morning for 30 years. The dining room, where we had celebrated every one of Ethan's birthdays. The office where we had planned every expansion of our business. I went up the stairs to my old room. Olivia had changed the decor, but I could see beyond her superficial modifications. I could see the room as it had been, how it should be. I spent the next few weeks restoring the estate, not to its original state exactly, but to something new, something that honored the past, but also looked toward the future. I hired new decorators. This time I chose every detail personally, colors I liked, furniture that had meaning, art that inspired me. I converted one of the guest rooms into a modern office from where I could manage the properties more efficiently. I installed new technology, updated security systems, everything I had wanted to do, but never had time for when Ethan lived there. The estate truly became my home. Not the family home, not the home I shared with memories of my husband, but my home, the space that reflected who I was now. A 66-year-old woman who had survived betrayal, who had maintained her dignity, and who had taught the hardest lesson of all. Ethan came to visit me when the restoration was complete. It had been 8 months since the party, 8 months since his fall. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see how much he had changed physically. He had gained a little healthy weight. His face no longer looked gaunt. His eyes had a clarity I hadn't seen in years. He was wearing simple but clean clothes, work pants, and a cotton shirt. I invited him in. He walked through the estate with an expression of wonder. He touched the walls gently, as if he couldn't believe he was back. But there was no possessiveness in his gestures, only appreciation. I made him tea, and we sat on the terrace overlooking the gardens. He told me about his progress. He had already paid off a third of his debts. He was saving consistently. His boss had promoted him to supervisor for his work ethic. His therapist had told him he was making exceptional progress. And most importantly, he told me that for the first time in his life, he felt proud of himself, not for what he had, but for what he was building with his own hands. I asked him if he had heard from Olivia. He nodded with a sad smile. He told me she had married again, to an older, rich man, with real properties that didn't have hidden clauses. Ethan laughed as he told it. He told me he used to think it was love, but now he could clearly see what it had always been, a transaction, and he had been too blind to see it. I told him I felt proud of him, not for what he had achieved yet, which was still little compared to the road he had left to travel, but for the fact that he was on the path, that he had accepted responsibility, that he hadn't run away. Ethan thanked me. He told me he knew I had no obligation to give him this chance, that many mothers would have closed the door forever, that he had destroyed the trust we had built throughout his life, and that he would spend the rest of his days trying to rebuild it. I explained something he needed to understand. I told him I hadn't done all this out of cruelty, that every step, from the legal clauses to blocking the accounts to letting the party happen and everything collapse publicly, had been with a purpose. The purpose of teaching him something words could never teach. That people are not tools, that respect is not optional, that gratitude is not weakness, and that true power comes not from what you possess, but from what you build with integrity. Ethan listened with tears in his eyes. He told me he understood now, that the lesson had been brutal, but necessary, that if I had simply forgiven and forgotten, he would never have really changed. He would have continued being the same weak and manipulable man Olivia had molded to her convenience. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the gardens. Finally, Ethan got up to leave. I told him he could come visit me whenever he wanted, that the doors of this house would always be open to him, but that the key, the one that represented true belonging, that he would have to earn back. He hugged me before leaving. It was a different hug than the one we had shared months ago. This one wasn't full of desperation or shame. It was full of genuine respect, of understanding, of love that had been tested by fire and survived. When he left, I went back to sit on the terrace. Susan had asked me once if all the pain was worth it, if the result justified the means. Now I had my answer. I looked at the estate behind me, the house I had built with my husband, the house I almost lost by trusting too much. The house I recovered, not with pleas or weakness, but with strategy, patience, and the will to let consequences teach what words couldn't. And I thought of Ethan, my son, the son who had lost his way, the son who had betrayed me in the deepest way, the son who now, perhaps for the first time in his life, was building something real. something no one could take away from him because it came from within. He had thought he had kicked me out of my own house. In reality, he had only signed the beginning of his true education. And when that mysterious man appeared at his party telling the truth he had ignored, when all the guests went hysterical and his perfect world collapsed, in that moment his true life began. The life where things have real value, where respect is earned, where mothers are not burdens, but architects who sometimes have to demolish to rebuild something better.